I sat in the sterile waiting room of Boston Children's Hospital, begging my parents to let me withdraw a fraction of the retirement fund I had built for a decade so my 6-year-old daughter could have emergency spine surgery. My father adjusted his silver watch, looked me dead in the eye, and told me to take out a second mortgage. My mother sighed, checking her phone, and complained that my crying was going to make her late for her lunch reservation at the country club. My name is Elena. I am 35 years old. Just 7 hours before this conversation, I had transferred $2,000 to their account to cover their club dues because they claimed they were short on cash. What they did not know, as they walked away from me in that corridor, leaving my daughter Chloe waiting for a surgery we could not afford, was that my best friend, a forensic accountant, had already run the numbers. She had just traced every single penny of my $100,000 retirement fund. It was not in a trust. It had flowed directly into the bank account of my gambling addict brother. Their cruelty in that hospital did not just break my heart, it permanently altered the power dynamic of our family and triggered their financial and social collapse. Before I walk you through exactly how I dismantled their lives, take a second to tell me your age, your location, and your local time down in the comments. Welcome to Sweet Karma Life. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever been treated like a personal ATM by relatives who do not care if you sink or swim. You are going to want to hear every detail of how I made them pay. Now let me bring you into that freezing hospital corridor on a Tuesday morning in November. Chloe was in room 412. The doctor said the sudden curvature in her spine was compressing her lungs. The surgery was out of network. The billing department needed a deposit of $40,000 by the end of the week. I had been funneling $10,000 a year into a family trust managed by my father, Richard, since I started working as a physical therapist at 25. It was supposed to be untouchable. It was supposed to be my safety net. I called them in a panic. They drove down from the suburbs, stepping into the pediatric wing looking like they were dressed for a real estate open house. My father wore his tailored navy blazer. My mother, Patricia, carried a leather designer handbag that cost more than my first car. I stood up when I saw them. My hands were shaking. I handed my father the surgical estimate. I told him I needed $40,000 from the trust. Today. He did not even look at the paper. He folded it in half and handed it back to me. He used that calm, reasonable tone he always used when he was about to deny me something. He said the market was down. He said withdrawing funds now would incur heavy tax penalties for the entire family portfolio. He told me I was an adult, I had a good job, and I needed to learn how to finance my own emergencies. He suggested I go to a high-risk lender. I stared at him. The fluorescent lights hummed above us. I reminded him that it was my money. I earned it. I deposited it. I needed it to save his granddaughter's ability to breathe without pain. My mother stepped in. She did not reach out to hug me. She did not ask how Chloe was doing. She checked her reflection in the glass of the waiting room window. She lowered her voice and told me I was making a scene. She said I was always so dramatic when things did not go my way. Then she tapped her phone screen and pointed out that if they did not leave in the next 10 minutes, they would lose their table at the club. At 7 o'clock that morning, I had sent them $2,000. My mother had texted me the night before, hinting heavily that an unexpected tax bill left them strapped for their membership renewal. I transferred it without a second thought. I always did. I was the reliable one, the problem solver. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I looked at the man who demanded my loyalty and my paychecks. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees. I simply nodded and told them to enjoy their lunch. They turned and walked toward the elevator, their footsteps echoing down the hall. I looked down at the phone clutched in my hand. The screen was still awake, displaying the digital receipt for the $2,000 country club transfer I had sent them just 7 hours ago. Then I raised my head and watched them walk away. My eyes locked onto the designer leather handbag swinging gently from my mother's shoulder. I recognized the brand. I knew the retail price. That bag cost exactly $40,000. It was the exact amount needed to stop my 6-year-old daughter's lungs from collapsing. The panic that had been suffocating me all morning suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I realized right then that I was not a daughter to them. I was a revenue stream. My love was a sunk cost. They thought they had won. They thought they had put me back in my place. They had no idea I was about to call Sarah, and that by the time the sun went down, I would have the proof to turn their entire reality to ash. I watched the elevator doors slide shut. The digital numbers above the metal frame dropped from 4 to 3 to 2 to lobby. My parents were gone. The air in the corridor felt heavy, smelling faintly of bleach and stale coffee. I did not collapse against the wall. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response to pain, but what I felt in that moment was not pain. It was an awakening. The fog of familial obligation evaporated, leaving behind a razor-sharp landscape of reality. I walked back into room 412. Chloe was asleep. The rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor was the only sound in the room. I sat down in the plastic chair beside her bed, pulled out my phone, and dialed Sarah. Sarah is not the kind of friend who offers empty platitudes. She does not tell you everything happens for a reason. She is a senior forensic accountant for a corporate firm in downtown Boston. Her daily life consists of dismantling shell companies and tracking hidden assets for messy divorces. She deals in ledgers, routing numbers, and undeniable proof. When she answered, I skipped the greeting. I told her my parents just refused to release the funds from the family trust to pay for my daughter's spinal surgery. I told her my father claimed the market was down and withdrawal penalties would hurt the portfolio. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Sarah asked a very specific, very dangerous question. She asked if I had ever actually seen the portfolio. I told her no. My father was a retired wealth manager. He handled all the paperwork. I just deposited $10,000 every January for the last 10 years into the routing number he provided. Sarah sighed. It was the heavy, exhausted sigh of a professional who has seen this exact scam 100 times. She told me to send her my social security number, the routing information I had been using, and any tax documents my father had given me to sign. I opened my email app, found the digital copies of my tax returns, and forwarded them to her secure server. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in the dark hospital room. Nurses came in and out, checking intravenous lines and charting vitals. The pediatric surgeon stopped by to confirm they were prepping the operating room for tomorrow morning. He needed the $40,000 deposit cleared by midnight. I nodded and assured him the money would be there. I had no idea how I was going to secure it, but I knew I would sell my own organs before I let my child suffer another day. I applied for an emergency high-risk medical loan on my phone. The terms were predatory, 25% interest. Because I needed the $40,000 released within hours, the lender required me to leverage my perfect credit score, sign a lien against my car, and authorize immediate wage garnishment from my clinical paychecks. Fresh. I signed the digital agreements without blinking. My flawless credit history was a byproduct of the financial discipline my father had supposedly drilled into me. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Sarah with an encrypted document attached. 2 minutes later, she called me. Her voice was devoid of emotion. It was the tone she used when delivering bad news to corporate clients. She told me there was no trust. There was no family portfolio. The routing number I had been sending my money to for a decade did not belong to a protected retirement account. It was a standard joint checking account registered under my father's name and one other person. I asked her who the second name was. I expected her to say my mother. I was prepared for the reality that they had simply stolen my savings to fund their country club lifestyle and their luxury vacations. But the truth was far more surgical. The second name on the account was Julian. Julian is my younger brother. He is 32 years old. For the past 5 years, my parents have paraded him around their social circle as a tech visionary. They claimed he was living in Palo Alto, building an artificial intelligence software company that was constantly on the verge of a massive buyout. He wore cashmere sweaters, flew first class, and never came home for the holidays because he was always allegedly closing a deal in Tokyo or London. Sarah instructed me to open the document. She walked me through the itemized columns. Over the last 5 years, every single time my annual $10,000 deposit hit that checking account, it did not stay there for more than 48 hours. The funds were immediately fractured. Sarah had tracked 42 separate wire transfers. The money was not going to Silicon Valley angel investors. It was flowing directly into offshore sports books, daily fantasy sports accounts, and high-stakes online poker sites. Julian was not a tech founder. He was a gambling addict. He was drowning in debt, and my parents had been using my blood, my sweat, and my financial security to bail him out. They had systematically drained my future to fund his sickness. The $100,000 I had worked 60-hour weeks to save, the money that was supposed to fix my daughter's spine, had been thrown away on football spreads and blackjack tables. The most chilling part was not the theft. It was the complicity. My father, the esteemed financial advisor, had meticulously structured the transfers to avoid triggering fraud alerts. He knew exactly what he was doing. My mother, who had just rolled her eyes at my tears in the corridor, knew she was carrying a handbag paid for by the illusion of my brother's success, a success entirely bankrolled by my stolen labor. They had watched me panic over my child's medical crisis while knowing they had already gambled away her lifeline. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The columns of numbers blurred, then snapped back into sharp focus. I looked at the routing numbers, the dates, the destinations. This was not just a betrayal. This was a blueprint. They had left a digital footprint wide enough to drive a freight train through. By avoiding the formal structure of a trust to hide the money, they had exposed themselves to federal scrutiny. Sarah stayed on the line. She asked what I wanted to do. She offered to help me draft a police report or contact a civil litigator. I told her no. A police report would lead to an investigation, a settlement, a quiet family disgrace swept under the rug. That was not enough. I did not want restitution. I wanted ruin. I wanted to dismantle the facade they had spent their entire lives building. I asked Sarah if she could map the exact legal implications of my father committing wire fraud to move stolen funds into my brother's accounts over state lines. I asked her to calculate the specific federal penalties for financial concealment and undeclared gambling revenue. I heard her keyboard clacking on the other end. She said yes. I hung up the phone and looked at Chloe. Her breathing was shallow. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. The fear that had paralyzed me all morning was gone. The woman who had begged her parents for help in the waiting room no longer existed. In her place was an auditor, calmly preparing a balance sheet. Tomorrow, my daughter would go into surgery, and I would begin constructing the trap. To understand why I chose the stage I did, you have to understand how Julian became the golden child and how I was groomed to be the sacrificial lamb. I sat in the dark hospital room, matching dates on my phone screen to memories I had tried to bury. Sarah had categorized a spreadsheet by month and year. My finger traced a line down to November 26th, 2 years ago. A withdrawal of $15,000. I did not need an accountant to tell me what that day was. It was Thanksgiving. I closed my eyes and the memory played back in high definition. I had just driven straight to my parents' house after a 12-hour shift at the rehabilitation clinic. My scrub still smelled like medical-grade sanitizer. I parked my 8-year-old sedan on the street because the driveway was blocked. Sitting in the center of the pristine concrete was a brand-new pearl-white Tesla. My mother was standing on the front porch holding a glass of Chardonnay. She was clapping. My father was inspecting the tires. Julian leaned against the driver's side door, wearing a tailored linen shirt that defied the freezing New England wind. He looked like a magazine cover. I looked like a janitor. When I walked up the driveway, my mother hugged me with one arm, careful not to spill her wine. She pointed at the car and whispered that Julian had just closed his first round of seed funding for his software company. She said the investors bought him the vehicle as a signing bonus. She beamed with a pride I had never seen directed at me. 2 weeks before that Thanksgiving, my mother had called me crying. She said the roof of their house had a severe leak. She claimed black mold was spreading through the attic insulation, and the insurance claim was denied. She needed $15,000 to hire a contractor immediately. She promised they would pay me back when my father's pension adjusted for inflation. I did not have $15,000 in liquid cash. I had to drain my emergency savings and take on weekend shifts at a secondary sports medicine facility. For 14 straight days, I manipulated the stiff joints of stroke survivors and guided athletes through agonizing pain until my own hands cramped and my knuckles swelled. I wired the money to the routing number she provided. Now, sitting next to my sleeping daughter, I looked at the spreadsheet. On November 10th, a deposit of $15,000 hit my father's checking account. On November 12th, the exact same amount was transferred to a routing number in Las Vegas. There was no contractor. There was no black mold. The roof was never leaking. I had bought the car. Or rather, I had covered the gambling debts that allowed Julian to use his own drained credit lines to lease the car and maintain his illusion. We sat around the dining room table that night eating dried turkey. My father poured 20-year-old scotch for him and Julian. They discussed market trends and venture capital. Julian threw around terms like equity user acquisition and return on investment. He had memorized the vocabulary of success. My father nodded along, treating him like an equal. I sat at the end of the table drinking tap water. I asked my mother when the roofers were scheduled to arrive. The temperature in the room dropped. My father placed his glass down hard enough to rattle the silverware. He looked at me with cold disappointment. He said family dinners were not the place to discuss menial household maintenance. He lectured me on tact. Later that evening, while Julian was in the living room demonstrating the car's autopilot feature on his phone, my father pulled me aside in the kitchen. He handed me a dish towel to dry the crystal glasses. He told me I lacked vision. He said Julian was building a legacy while I was just punching a clock. Then he deployed the manipulation tactic they always used. He softened his voice and patted my shoulder. He said they never had to worry about me because I was so independent. He called me their rock. He said Julian needed a different kind of support to achieve his genius, and it was our duty as a family to foster that brilliance. For years, I wore that word like a badge of honor. Independent, strong, reliable. I thought it meant they respected me. Staring at the glowing numbers on Sarah's spreadsheet, the truth crystallized. Those words were not compliments. They were a sedative. They praised my resilience so I would not notice the parasite attached to my bank account. They called me strong so I would carry the weight of my brother's failures without complaining. I kept scrolling through the forensic report. The patterns were undeniable. Every manufactured crisis was a cover story. A $5,000 emergency dental surgery for my mother last spring aligned perfectly with the wire transfer to an offshore poker site. A $3,000 property tax shortfall matched a deposit to a fantasy football application. My parents were not victims of his addiction. They were the architects of it. They facilitated his sickness to protect their own social standing. If Julian failed, their country club friends would know their son was a fraud. So they used my labor as collateral. They turned my empathy into a revenue stream. I was not a daughter. I was the underwriter for their delusion. I looked away from the phone and watched Chloe breathe. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven intervals. The anger inside me was no longer a fire. It was ice. Fire burns out. Ice preserves. I needed this coldness for what was coming next. The wall clock in the hospital room ticked past 5 in the morning. Dawn was creeping through the blinds, painting the sterile walls in shades of gray. I had not slept in 24 hours, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I drafted a short, polite text message to my parents. I told them Chloe was going into surgery in 3 hours. I said I was scared. I asked if they could come sit with me in the waiting room. I did not ask for money. I just asked for their presence. I pressed send. I knew what the response would be. I knew they would not come, but I needed their refusal on the record. I needed them to make their final choice, because a trap only works if the prey walks into it willingly. The door to the room opened with a soft click. The morning shift nurse walked in carrying a clipboard, followed closely by the pediatric surgeon. He looked at my chart, then looked at me. His expression was serious. He asked if the financial deposit had been secured. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my scrubs. I told him yes. I told him the money would be cleared by noon. I had a high-interest medical loan waiting for my signature. I would sign my life away today, but by next week, the people who forced me into this corner would lose everything they owned. The nurse gently woke Chloe to begin the pre-operative procedures. My phone remained silent. No replies, no missed calls. The stage was set. The surgery was happening. And the silence from my family was the final piece of evidence I needed to initiate their destruction. The orderly wheeled Chloe away at exactly 8 in the morning. I walked beside the gurney until we reached the double doors of the surgical wing. My daughter squeezed 2 of my fingers. Her skin was cold. I promised I would be sitting right there when she woke up. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, sealing her inside with the surgeons, and I turned back to face the waiting room. It was a Tuesday. The room was vast, filled with rows of identical blue fabric chairs arranged in neat, orderly blocks. Every single chair was empty. There was no father pacing the floor. There was no mother holding a cup of tea. There was only the low hum of a vending machine in the corner and the sterile smell of industrial floor cleaner. I sat down in the center row. I placed my purse on the seat next to me. I took out my phone. The screen was blank. No missed calls. No text messages asking if the anesthesia went smoothly. I unlocked the device and opened a social media app. The algorithm, blind to my current reality, placed my brother's profile at the very top of my feed. Julian had posted a new story 10 minutes ago. I tapped the glowing circle. The image loaded in crisp resolution. It was a close-up of a crystal flute filled with champagne, resting on the polished wooden console of a first-class airline seat. In the background, out the oval window, the tarmac of Logan International stretched under a clear morning sky. He had tagged his location. He was on a direct flight to Las Vegas. The caption read, "Big moves today. Never stop building." I stared at the photograph. I did not feel rage. I felt a cold, calculating precision. A first-class ticket booked last minute to Nevada cost roughly $1,800. The champagne in the glass was standard premium airline fare, while my 6-year-old child was being prepped to have titanium rods fused to her spine. My brother was flying across the country to feed his addiction using the money I had bled for. I swiped left on the screen. The next post was from my mother. It was a picture of 3 different wine glasses lined up on a marble tasting counter. The caption read, "Finalizing the menu for the Big 4-0, only the best for our guest." My parents were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary the following weekend. It was not going to be a quiet dinner. They had rented the grand ballroom at the Westwood Country Club. They had invited 100 of their most affluent friends, business partners, and social rivals. For the past 6 months, my mother had talked about nothing else. The party was designed to be a monument to their success, a curated exhibition of their flawless family lineage. When I had asked my mother 3 days prior if she would be at the hospital during the surgery, she had pressed her hand to her chest and sighed. She claimed the smell of clinical antiseptic triggered her migraines. My father had chimed in, staring solemnly at the floor, stating he simply could not bear the emotional toll of seeing his granddaughter in a hospital gown. They constructed an elaborate narrative of fragile sensitivity to excuse their profound selfishness. Sitting in that empty blue chair, I felt something inside me finally snap. It was not a loud break. It was the quiet, definitive sound of a steel cable snapping under too much tension. For 35 years, I had operated under the sunk cost fallacy of family loyalty. I believed that if I just endured enough dismissals, if I just provided enough financial support, if I just proved my utility one more time, they would eventually love me the way they loved Julian. I realized in that sterile waiting room that true family is not a biological default. It is an active choice. My parents had made their choice every time they routed my deposits to an offshore sportsbook. They made their choice when they opted to taste Pinot Noir while my daughter was cut open. The debt I owed them for giving me life had been paid in full, with exorbitant interest. I was done waiting for people who were never going to arrive. The hospital doors slid open. I looked up, expecting a nurse. It was Sarah. She walked toward me, wearing a sharp black trench coat, carrying a cardboard tray holding 2 large black coffees. Under her arm, she clutched a thick manila folder. She did not offer me a sympathetic smile. She did not ask how I was holding up. She knew I did not need pity. I needed ammunition. She handed me a coffee and sat in the chair next to mine. She placed the manila folder on her lap and flipped it open. Inside were stacks of printed spreadsheets, bank records, and legal summaries. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and looked at me. Her eyes were sharp. She told me she had spent the entire night cross-referencing federal financial statutes. What my parents had done was not just morally bankrupt, it was a severe violation of federal law. By funneling $100,000 of my money into Julian's accounts under the guise of a fake trust, my father had committed textbook wire fraud and financial concealment. Furthermore, because Julian had used those stolen funds on unregulated gambling sites and failed to report his sporadic winnings, he was exposed to massive tax evasion penalties. Sarah tapped a specific column of numbers with her manicured fingernail. She explained that the Internal Revenue Service does not care about family drama. They care about undeclared revenue. My father, a former wealth manager, knew the exact legal boundaries he was crossing. He had knowingly engaged in financial concealment to protect his son's vices. I listened to her lay out the facts. Every word she spoke was a brick I could use to build their prison. I asked her how long an audit would take to freeze their assets once a formal report was filed. She said if the tip included the exact routing numbers, dates, and amounts, the automated flagging system could trigger an asset freeze within days. We sat in silence for a moment. The vending machine hummed. The coffee burned the back of my throat, keeping me awake, keeping me focused. I looked at the manila folder. I could mail these documents to the authorities today. I could end it quietly. But a quiet ending would allow my parents to spin the narrative. They would play the victims. They would tell their country club friends that they had made a minor clerical error and that I was an ungrateful daughter trying to ruin them over a misunderstanding. They would maintain their social standing while privately dealing with the fines. I needed an audience. I needed the very people they were trying to impress to witness their unmasking. I looked at Sarah. I asked her if she was free next Saturday night. She raised an eyebrow. I told her about the 40th anniversary party at the Westwood Country Club. I told her my parents had asked me to give a toast to honor their legacy. I said I thought it was only fitting that I present them with a detailed account of everything they had built. Sarah closed the folder. A slow, calculating smile spread across her face. She handed the entire stack of documents to me. 3 hours later, the pediatric surgeon walked through the double doors. He pulled down his surgical mask. He looked exhausted, but relaxed. He told me the fusion was a success. Chloe was in recovery. Her vitals were strong. The curvature was corrected. I thanked him. I walked into the recovery room and stood by my daughter's bed. She was sleeping peacefully, surrounded by monitors. The heavy weight that had been pressing on my lungs for weeks finally lifted. My child was safe. My sole vulnerability was protected. I pulled out my phone. I needed to set the stage. I needed to give my parents the illusion that they were still in control. I drafted a message to my mother, carefully crafting the tone of a defeated, desperate daughter. I had to let them think they had won the battle today, so they would eagerly walk right into the slaughterhouse next week. Chloe slept through her first full day of recovery. The pediatric nurses monitored her vitals, adjusting the morphine drip and checking the incision site along her spine. Her breathing was deep and even. For the first time in 6 months, she was not in pain. I sat beside her bed until Wednesday morning, watching the sun rise over the Boston skyline. Then I kissed her forehead, walked out to my car, and drove to the affluent suburb of Weston to execute the next phase of the plan. My parents lived in a 4,000 square foot colonial house sitting on 2 acres of manicured land. It was the house I grew up in. It was the house my father had refused to leverage a dime against to save his granddaughter's mobility. Walking up the slate pathway, I noted the fresh landscaping, the newly painted shutters, and the imported ceramic pots flanking the oak front door. Every detail projected an image of generational stability and quiet wealth. I unlocked the door with my spare key. The foyer smelled of fresh lilies and lemon furniture polish. I found them in the sunroom at the back of the house. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My father was seated at the glass table, reading the Wall Street Journal. My mother was surrounded by stacks of thick, cream-colored envelopes, meticulously organizing the seating chart for their upcoming anniversary gala. They looked up when I walked in. Neither of them stood to greet me. My mother paused with a gold pen hovering over a piece of thick cardstock. She offered a tight, polite smile and asked how the hospital food was, dodging any direct inquiry about the surgery itself. I took a breath and stepped into the role I had rehearsed during the drive. I let my shoulders slump. I manufactured a look of deep, crushing exhaustion. I told them the spinal fusion was successful and Chloe was resting. Then I delivered the script they wanted to hear. I looked at the floor and told them they were right. I said I had panicked on Tuesday morning and acted unprofessionally by demanding money from the family portfolio. I told them I took my father's advice and went to a private medical lender. I secured the $40,000. I confessed that the terms were brutal. I told them I signed a contract with a 25% annual percentage rate, using my car and my future wages as collateral. I painted a picture of my own financial ruin, portraying myself as a desperate woman who would be drowning in high-interest debt for the next decade. I watched their faces carefully. The reaction was subtle but chilling. The tension vanished from my father's jaw. He picked up his bone china teacup and took a slow, deliberate sip of his Earl Grey tea. He set the cup down and meticulously smoothed out a tiny crease on the front page of his Wall Street Journal. He did not offer to help me cover the predatory interest rate. He did not express sorrow that his daughter was now financially shackled. Instead, a terrifyingly smug smile spread across his face, followed by a slow, approving nod. He leaned forward and delivered a lecture on fiscal responsibility. He said the free market is the best teacher. He told me that taking on this debt would instill a sense of discipline in me that relying on family funds never could. Coming from a retired wealth manager who was secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his son's gambling losses, the hypocrisy was a masterclass in psychological projection. My mother chimed in, perfectly on cue. She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her diamond rings caught the morning light. She deployed the toxic positivity she always used to keep me compliant. She said she was so proud of my independence. She called me their resilient girl, the one who never needed rescuing. She said Julian always needed guidance, but I was the foundation of the family. I did not pull my hand away. I looked at her and smiled. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and accepted the compliment. I needed them to feel completely secure, completely absolved of any guilt. Then I pivoted to the trap. I looked at the stacks of RSVPs scattered across the table. I told them that nearly losing Chloe had given me a new perspective on the importance of family legacy. I said I wanted to do something special for their 40th anniversary party on Saturday. I volunteered to give the keynote toast at the country club. I proposed putting together a visual presentation, a slideshow that would highlight my father's financial acumen, his dedication to building a secure future, and my mother's flawless devotion to our family unit. My mother clasped her hands together in genuine delight. She had been stressing over how to entertain the guests between the cocktail hour and the main course. A tearful, admiring speech from her hard-working, independent daughter was the perfect centerpiece. It would validate their parenting in front of every doctor, lawyer, and corporate executive in their social circle. My father agreed, noting that a speech about generational wealth building would resonate well with his former partners who would be in attendance. They swallowed the bait without a second of hesitation. I stayed for another 20 minutes, helping my mother arrange the seating chart. I made sure to note exactly where the projection screen would be placed in the Westwood Country Club ballroom and confirm the audiovisual capabilities of the venue. Once I had all the logistical details, I excused myself, citing a need to return to the pediatric ward. I walked out of the Colonial House, got into my car, and locked the doors. The defeated posture I had maintained in the sunroom instantly vanished. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah. While I was feeding my parents the illusion of my submission, Sarah had been sitting in her downtown office compiling the forensic dossier. She had spent the morning preparing IRS Form 211. In the United States, the Internal Revenue Service offers a whistleblower program. If you provide specific, credible, and actionable evidence of significant tax fraud, the federal government does not just investigate, they act with devastating speed. Sarah had organized the 42 wire transfers into a clear chronological map. She compiled the receiving accounts in Nevada, linking them directly to Julian's unregulated betting profiles. She explained that, while the Internal Revenue Service moves slowly, private banks do not play games with their federal charters. Instead of just relying on a government audit, she drafted a highly specific fraud alert directly to the Compliance and Anti-Money Laundering Division of my father's primary bank. The alert detailed the structured offshore transfers and flagged them as severe federal compliance risks. I told her to hold both the bank alert and the official IRS whistleblower report until Saturday night. Once the party started, she would hit send on everything. By Monday morning, the bank's automated risk algorithms would flag his profile. By Wednesday, the internal asset freezes would begin, locking him out of his own vault. I started the engine of my car. I looked back at the house one last time. My parents were inside, sipping their tea, convinced they had navigated a crisis without spending a dime or sacrificing their image. They thought Saturday night was going to be a coronation of their success. They had no idea I was bringing a guillotine to the ballroom. Saturday evening arrived with a sharp chill in the November air. The Westwood Country Club sits on a private hill overlooking a pristine golf course. Valets in crisp white shirts darted around the circular driveway, taking the keys to imported German sports cars and luxury SUVs. I parked my 8-year-old sedan in the overflow lot near the service entrance and walked up the stone steps. The grand ballroom was a monument to manufactured prestige. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over 30 round tables. A string quartet played a classical arrangement in the corner. Waiters in black vests circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with caviar blinis and vintage champagne. I stood near the entrance and observed the guests. My parents had invited 100 of the most influential people in their social orbit. These were not neighbors who borrowed sugar. These were orthopedic surgeons, senior partners at corporate law firms, and regional vice presidents of investment banks. This was a crowd that measured human worth entirely by zip codes, tax brackets, and portfolio yields. They were the jury my parents had spent 40 years cultivating, and tonight they would serve as the witnesses to their execution. I spotted Julian standing near an elaborate ice sculpture carved into the shape of a swan. He wore a midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo. He held a crystal glass of top-shelf bourbon in his right hand. He was deep in conversation with 2 venture capitalists my father had introduced him to earlier that year. Julian never finished his sophomore year at a mid-tier state college, but he possessed a terrifying sociopathic charm. He knew how to mirror the arrogance of wealthy men. I watched him gesture expansively, leaning in to speak softly. He was likely pitching the phantom artificial intelligence startup. The investors nodded, captivated by his polished illusion. They had no idea the suit he was wearing, the bourbon he was drinking, and the first-class ticket that brought him here were all funded by the stolen savings of a physical therapist. My mother glided through the center of the room. She wore an emerald silk gown designed by Carolina Herrera. She touched shoulders, kissed cheeks, and accepted glowing compliments on 4 decades of marital success. Her hair was styled perfectly, her diamond necklace catching the light from the chandeliers. She looked flawless. The lighting in the ballroom was specifically engineered to erase shadows, which perfectly matched her lifelong desire to erase reality. I found my assigned seat at table 12. It was located near the back of the room, near the kitchen doors. It was a strategic placement. My parents needed me visible enough to prove family unity, but far enough away so my off-the-rack black dress would not clash with the aesthetic of the head table. The contrast between my current reality and this opulent display was staggering. Just 4 days ago, I was sitting under fluorescent lights in a sterile pediatric ward, watching machines breathe for my daughter. I had signed a loan document that shackled me to a 25% interest rate just to keep her alive. Now I was sitting in a room where the floral arrangements alone cost more than my daughter's surgical deposit. I did not touch the prime rib placed in front of me. I did not drink the imported Bordeaux poured into my glass. I sat with my back straight, my hands resting flat on the white linen tablecloth. Right next to my plate was a thick brown manila envelope. It contained the printed forensic ledgers Sarah had compiled. I looked up at the stage at the front of the ballroom. A wooden podium stood in the center, flanked by towering vases of white orchids. Directly behind the podium was a massive drop-down projection screen. Earlier that afternoon, I had arrived before the guests and handed a USB drive to the club's audio-visual technician. I told him it was a surprise slideshow of cherished family memories. He had smiled warmly and plugged it directly into the master console, leaving the remote control resting on the podium. The string quartet stopped playing. The waiters retreated to the edges of the room. The low murmur of conversation faded into a respectful silence as my father stepped up to the microphone. He tapped it twice. He adjusted his silk tie and smiled at the crowd. He spoke for 10 minutes about his career, the financial firm he helped build, and the core values of fiscal discipline he had instilled in his children. He used heavy, commanding words like integrity, stewardship, and generational wealth. He told an anecdote about the importance of self-reliance and the dangers of living beyond your means. I listened to the man who had secretly wired hundreds of thousands of undeclared dollars to cover offshore gambling debts lecture a room full of bankers on the virtues of honesty. My pulse remained steady. The hypocrisy was no longer painful. It was the necessary fuel for what I was about to do. My father finished his speech to a round of enthusiastic applause and handed the microphone to my mother. She stepped forward, dabbing the corner of her eye with a linen napkin, being careful not to smudge her expensive makeup. She looked out at the sea of affluent faces and spoke about the sacrifices they made to ensure their children had every advantage. She pointed directly at Julian. She called him their visionary. She told the room that his success in the tech sector was a testament to what happens when parents nurture ambition and provide the right foundation. The crowd offered another polite round of applause. Julian raised his bourbon glass in a mock salute, soaking in the stolen validation. Then my mother shifted her gaze toward the back of the room. She found table 12. Her voice dropped an octave, adopting a tone of rehearsed maternal affection. She spoke about resilience. She told the guests that while Julian was out conquering the tech world, they had another anchor in the family. She introduced me as their rock. She called me the steady, hard-working daughter who embodied the quiet strength of their family legacy. She praised my independence, stating that I was a woman who never asked for handouts and always handled my own burdens. She gestured toward the stage. She asked the guests to welcome me up to the podium to share a few words, a toast to 40 years of unwavering family loyalty. The spotlight swung across the dark room, illuminating my table. 100 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. The applause began, rhythmic and expectant. I stood up. I did not take my purse. I did not take a glass of champagne to raise for the toast. I picked up the brown manila envelope. I walked past the round tables. I walked past the venture capitalists. I walked past my brother, who offered a smug, patronizing smile as I went by. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps to the stage. I set the envelope down on the podium, right next to the remote control for the projector. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the silent, waiting crowd. I stood behind the mahogany podium. The microphone picked up the quiet sound of my breathing, amplifying it through the ballroom speakers. 100 faces looked up at me. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint clinking of silverware from the kitchen. I looked down at table 12, then scanned the room until my eyes found my mother in her emerald dress, my father with his chest puffed out in pride, and Julian holding his bourbon glass near the venture capitalists. They expected a tribute. They expected me to validate their 40-year charade. I gripped the edges of the podium. My hands were entirely steady. I leaned into the microphone. I began by thanking the guests for attending. I said it was a privilege to stand before a room full of people who understood the true value of an investment. I looked directly at my father. I told the crowd that growing up in his house had taught me profound lessons about financial discipline, legacy, and the hidden costs of family loyalty. My father smiled, nodding in agreement. I said my parents had always emphasized transparency. I told the room that tonight, to properly honor their legacy, I wanted to be perfectly transparent about how this family operates. I picked up the black remote control resting on the wood surface. I pointed it at the ceiling and pressed the power button. A mechanical hum filled the air. The massive white projection screen slowly unrolled from the ceiling behind me. The projector mounted above the chandelier clicked on, casting a bright rectangular light across the stage. The guests shifted in their seats, expecting a montage of wedding photos, childhood vacations, and holiday dinners. The first slide appeared. It was a scanned copy of a forensic bank ledger. It was stark white, filled with rows of black text, routing numbers, and federal tax identifiers. A wave of confusion washed over the ballroom. People squinted. My mother tilted her head, her smile freezing in place. I did not break eye contact with the crowd. I stated clearly that for the past 10 years, I had worked 60-hour weeks as a physical therapist. I told them I had systematically deposited $100,000 into what I was told was a protected family trust, managed by my father, to secure my daughter's future. I pressed the next button on the remote. A red circle appeared on the screen, highlighting a specific row of numbers. I read the data out loud. My voice was clinical and flat, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. I read the date, January 4th, a deposit of $10,000. I read the corresponding transfer date, January 6th, a withdrawal of $10,000. I read the destination, a routing number in Nevada registered to a high-stakes sports betting domain. Someone in the front row gasped softly. The venture capitalist standing next to Julian stopped smiling. I clicked to the next slide. Another spreadsheet, another red circle. I reminded the room about the pearl-white Tesla Julian received 2 years ago. My mother had just told this very crowd it was a corporate bonus from his tech investors. I pointed to the screen. I read the transfer of $15,000 from my stolen savings, moved directly into Julian's personal checking account the day before the car was leased. I clicked again. The slides moved faster. $5,000 to an offshore poker site. $3,000 to a daily fantasy sports application. $8,000 to a digital casino. I listed the dates. I listed the amounts.
I explicitly stated that Julian did not own an artificial intelligence company. He did not have venture capital backing. He was an unemployed gambling addict, and my father had spent 5 years committing federal wire fraud to use my retirement fund to cover his son's debts. The silence in the ballroom transformed. It was no longer expectant. It was toxic. The air felt heavy with the collective realization of the affluent crowd. They were looking at a family of frauds. Julian dropped his glass. The crystal shattered against the hardwood floor. The sound cracked like a gunshot. The venture capitalist physically stepped away from him, creating a wide circle of isolation around my brother. His face drained of color. He looked like a cornered animal. My father realized what was happening. The polished facade of the retired wealth manager shattered. His face turned deep crimson. He pushed his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed to the floor. He marched toward the stage. His footsteps were heavy. He pointed a trembling finger at me. He shouted into the silent room, demanding I turn the projector off. He yelled that I was having a mental breakdown. He tried to tell his friends it was a fabricated spreadsheet. I did not flinch. I did not step back. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, I gripped the microphone and raised my voice just enough to overpower his. I told him to stay exactly where he was. The authority in my tone stopped him. He froze on the first step. I looked down at him, then looked back at the crowd. I had delivered the financial reality. Now I needed to deliver the moral bankruptcy. I told the room that the money was gone. I said I could accept being robbed, but I could not accept what happened on Tuesday morning. I described the pediatric ward at Boston Children's Hospital. I spoke clearly, ensuring every orthopedic surgeon, every parent, every human being in that room heard every single word. I explained that my 6-year-old daughter Chloe needed emergency spinal fusion surgery to prevent her lungs from collapsing. I stated the exact cost of the medical deposit, $40,000. I pointed at my mother, who was now gripping the edge of her table, her face buried in her hands. I pointed at my father, standing paralyzed on the stairs. I told the room that I begged them for my own money to save my child's life. I revealed my father's advice. I repeated his exact words. I told the crowd that the esteemed wealth manager standing before them looked his daughter in the eye and told her to take out a high-interest predatory loan, claiming the market was too volatile to withdraw funds. I told them my mother complained that my tears were going to make her late for her lunch reservation at this very club. The ballroom was dead silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. The judgment radiating from the guests was palpable. In a society that values status, stealing is frowned upon, but sacrificing a child's life to protect a gambling addict is an unforgivable social sin. I delivered the final blow. I clicked the remote one last time. The screen behind me changed to a photograph. It was the screenshot from Julian's social media account. The crystal flute of champagne, the first-class window seat, the timestamp proving it was taken on the morning of my daughter's surgery. I looked at my brother. Then I looked at the crowd. I stated the final truth. I said that while my 6-year-old was being cut open on an operating table, the golden child of this family was flying first class to Las Vegas using the money that was supposed to save her spine. I set the remote down. I closed the manila folder. I had nothing left to say. The prosecution rested. The truth was out, and the destruction of their manufactured kingdom was complete. I picked up my folder, stepped off the podium, and prepared to walk out of the wreckage I had just created. I stepped off the wooden podium. The thick carpet muffled the sound of my heels as I walked down the 3 steps to the ballroom floor. I did not look back at the projection screen. The glaring white light of the financial ledgers continued to illuminate the room, casting long, harsh shadows across the faces of the guests. I walked straight down the center aisle, holding my brown manila envelope. The reaction of the crowd was not explosive. In high society, true devastation is never loud. It was a quiet, synchronized withdrawal. These were people who built their entire lives on reputation, asset management, and the careful mitigation of risk. To them, my father was no longer a peer. He was a liability. He had committed wire fraud. He had orchestrated a multi-year embezzlement scheme against his own daughter. Financial crimes in this specific social circle are treated like an infectious disease. If you stand too close to the infected, the government might start looking at your own portfolios. I watched the self-preservation instinct kick in across the room. The 2 venture capitalists standing near my brother were the first to move. Julian had dropped his glass of bourbon, and the amber liquid was seeping into the expensive rug. He held his hands up, offering a frantic, wet smile. He stammered, telling the investors it was a jealous sibling prank, a fabricated slideshow meant to ruin his big night. He reached out to touch the arm of the taller investor. The man stepped back so quickly he bumped into a cocktail table. He looked at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not ask for clarification. He did not offer a polite excuse. He simply set his half-empty glass on the nearest tray, turned his back on my brother, and walked toward the exit. The second investor followed without a word. Julian was left standing alone in a puddle of shattered crystal. his sociopathic charm entirely useless against the undeniable proof of federal tax identifiers. I continued walking toward the heavy brass doors at the back of the room. I passed table after table of silent, staring faces. My father was still frozen on the staircase leading to the stage. He looked out at the sea of his friends and former colleagues. I made direct eye contact with Harrison Caldwell, a senior managing partner at the wealth management firm my father had helped build. Harrison was a man who prized integrity above all else. He looked at my father, shook his head slowly, and whispered something to his wife. They both stood up. Harrison did not look angry. He looked repulsed. He guided his wife toward the coat check. That movement broke the spell. It was the signal the rest of the room needed. The scrape of wooden chairs pushing back against the floor echoed through the ballroom. Guests began standing up in groups of 4 and 6. They did not say goodbye to the hosts. They did not linger near the bar. They moved with a hurried, deliberate pace toward the doors, desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius of a ruined family. I was 10 feet away from the exit when my mother intercepted me. She materialized from the crowd, her emerald silk gown rustling sharply. Her face was flushed, her expensive makeup streaked with tears of panic. She grabbed my upper arm. Her fingernails dug into my skin through the fabric of my dress. She tried to pull me toward a secluded alcove near the kitchen doors, desperate to hide the confrontation from the departing guests. I planted my feet and refused to move. She looked around frantically, offering tight synthetic smiles to the people walking past us, whispering that it was just a misunderstanding, just a bit of family drama. No one stopped. No one offered sympathy. They looked through her. When she realized the audience was gone, she turned her full attention back to me. The toxic positivity she had weaponized for decades vanished, replaced by sheer, desperate venom. She hissed under her breath, asking how I could do this to them. She accused me of destroying their 40th anniversary. She said I had humiliated the family in front of the most important people in the city. She demanded I go back up to the microphone and tell everyone I had forged the documents because I was grieving the stress of my daughter's surgery. She actually wanted me to weaponize my child's medical crisis to save her country club membership. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not try to pull away. I just stared at her fingers until she felt the coldness of my gaze and slowly let go. I looked into the eyes of the woman who had birthed me. The woman who had complained about my tears in a hospital corridor while she wore a handbag funded by my stolen labor. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but the profound, weightless relief of an amputee who has finally severed a rotting limb. I told her I did not humiliate them. I told her I simply introduced them to their friends. She opened her mouth to argue, her chest heaving, but I did not let her speak. I delivered the final calculated truth of our relationship. I told her that for the last 10 years, I had purchased my peace of mind with every deposit I made into that fake account. I told her the debt of my childhood was paid in full. I looked over her shoulder at my father, who was standing alone by the empty tables, and at my brother, who was pacing near the ice sculpture, holding his head in his hands. I looked back at my mother and told her that from this moment forward, they would have to afford each other. I turned around and pushed open the heavy brass doors. The cold November night air hit my face, crisp and clean. The parking lot was a chaotic scene of valets sprinting to retrieve luxury vehicles for the mass exodus of guests. I handed my ticket to the attendant. 5 minutes later, he pulled my 8-year-old sedan up to the curb, idling between a new Porsche and a black town car. I had spent years feeling embarrassed by this car when I parked it outside my parents' colonial house. Tonight, sliding into the worn fabric seat, it felt like a chariot. I drove down the winding hill of the Westwood Country Club, leaving the glowing chandeliers and the shattered remnants of my family behind me. I merged onto the highway heading back toward the city, back toward the pediatric recovery ward where my daughter was sleeping. My phone remained silent on the passenger seat. There were no furious text messages. There were no demanding phone calls. They were too busy drowning in the social wreckage to lash out at me. But as I drove through the dark streets of Boston, a small, satisfied smile formed on my face. My parents thought the worst was over.
They thought losing their friends and their reputation was the ultimate punishment. They believed the nightmare would end when the last guest drove away from the country club. They had no idea that the social ruin was just the appetizer. I did not know that while they were weeping in an empty ballroom, my friend Sarah was sitting at her kitchen table, pressing a single key on her laptop. They did not know she had just transmitted the encrypted whistleblower dossier directly to the fraud division of the Internal Revenue Service. The social death happened on Saturday night. The legal obliteration was waiting for them on Monday morning. Wednesday morning arrived with a quiet grace. 3 days had passed since the disaster at the Westwood Country Club. Inside room 412 at Boston Children's Hospital, the atmosphere was light. Chloe was sitting up in bed, eating a cup of strawberry gelatin, drawing with a box of new crayons. The titanium rods in her back were holding perfectly. The pediatric nurses were chatting in the hallway, preparing our discharge paperwork. Everything within my immediate radius was healing. Everything outside of it was burning to the ground. My phone vibrated on the plastic bedside table. The screen lit up, displaying my father's name. For 35 years, seeing that name on a screen dictated my heart rate. It signaled an impending assignment, a sharp criticism, or a demand for capital. Today, it signaled nothing. I did not reach for the device. I let it ring until it stopped. 30 seconds later, my mother's name appeared. I let that ring too. I opened the visual voicemail application and watched the automated transcription generate text across my screen in real time. My father's message lacked the baritone authority he used to command boardrooms and dinner tables. He sounded breathless, his words stumbling over each other in a frantic rush. He stated he had gone to his private bank branch to wire a large retainer to a crisis management firm, attempting to control the social fallout from Saturday night. The teller had looked at her monitor, picked up her desk phone, and called the branch manager. My father's accounts were not just overdrawn. They were locked. A federal hold had been placed on every single asset bearing his Social Security number. Private banks operate with a terrifying emotionless efficiency when their own liability is on the line. When Sarah submitted the targeted fraud alert on Saturday night, it bypassed human reviewers and directly triggered the bank's automated compliance algorithms. The system does not care about country club memberships or family legacy. It cares about mitigating risk. Sarah's report included the exact dates, routing numbers, and IP addresses of the 42 wire transfers. My father had used structured incremental transactions to bypass standard reporting software. But by executing those transfers to fund unregulated offshore betting accounts, he triggered severe anti-money laundering protocols. The bank froze his assets immediately to protect themselves pending a full internal investigation. They locked him out of his liquid cash, while the IRS began quietly building their federal tax evasion case in the background. Julian was the secondary target of the federal sweep, but his fall was infinitely steeper. The investigators categorized his gambling revenue and the stolen funds as undeclared income. Julian had operated under the arrogant delusion that moving money through digital wallets made him untraceable. But digital footprints are permanent. With his bank accounts frozen, Julian could not pay his monthly minimums to the private bookies who floated his high-stakes wagers. My brother was no longer fielding calls from venture capitalists. He was fielding calls from debt collectors who operate far outside the boundaries of the legal system. The tech visionary who sipped premium champagne in a first-class window seat was now stranded in a cheap motel off the Vegas Strip, unable to buy a plane ticket home. He was simultaneously facing federal tax evasion charges and the physical consequences of unpaid gambling debts. His primary funding source, my stolen retirement, was vaporized. I scrolled down to read my mother's transcribed voicemail. She was weeping. It was not the calculated performative crying she used to manipulate me during holidays. It was the raw, guttural sound of a woman watching her entire identity dissolve. The Westwood Country Club processes their monthly membership dues automatically on the 15th of the month. The draft hit their frozen checking account and bounced. The club management, already eager to purge them after the catastrophic anniversary party, did not offer a grace period. They immediately suspended the membership. My mother was officially locked out of the only social ecosystem she cared about. The social death was now a financial reality. But the true masterpiece of their ruin was the colonial house in Weston. During Sarah's meticulous forensic audit, she uncovered a detail I had missed. My father had not just stolen my money to float Julian's addiction. He had taken out a massive home equity line of credit against the house 2 years prior to maintain their liquid cash flow. The terms of that specific loan required a strict minimum balance in his primary portfolio to prove ongoing solvency. The federal freeze dropped his accessible portfolio balance to 0. This triggered an automatic default clause with the mortgage lender. The bank was initiating the early stages of foreclosure. I sat in the hospital chair, reading the words on my glowing screen. I remembered my father standing in this exact building just 7 days ago. I remembered the tailored navy blazer. I remembered him looking at a mother terrified for her child's life and coldly instructing me to go to a high-risk lender. He told me the free market was the best teacher. He told me to finance my own emergencies. Now, he was losing his 4,000-square-foot monument to generational wealth. The free market was indeed teaching a masterclass, and he was the star pupil. My phone buzzed again. It was a text message from Julian. He begged for a wire transfer, calling me his only hope, promising he was ready to seek treatment. I looked at the screen. I felt a clinical detachment, like a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction behind reinforced glass. I did not reply. I took screenshots of every voicemail transcription and every text message. I forwarded the entire digital file to a ruthless civil litigation attorney Sarah had recommended. I drafted a brief email instructing the lawyer to issue a formal cease and desist order to all 3 of them. Then, I opened my contact list. I selected my father's name. I scrolled to the bottom of the screen. I pressed block caller. I selected my mother's name. I pressed block caller. I selected Julian. I pressed block. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of waiting for an apology that would never arrive. It was the clean, sweeping silence of a locked steel door. They were trapped in a prison constructed entirely of their own greed, their own lies, and their own arrogance. I did not destroy them. I merely handed the authorities the map of the destruction they built themselves. I put my phone in my purse, stood up, and walked over to my daughter's bed to pack her bags. Our time in the dark was over. 6 months have passed since that cold November night. It is late May now. The harsh New England winter has thawed into a bright, humid spring. I am sitting on the wooden back deck of a small rented farmhouse in the suburbs west of Boston. The property is modest. The paint on the siding is chipping near the gutters. There are no imported ceramic pots flanking the doors. There is no manicured acreage or circle driveway. But the air out here smells like damp earth and blooming lilac, and most importantly, the space belongs entirely to me. I hold a cup of black coffee and watch my daughter in the grass. Chloe is wearing denim overalls and a yellow cotton shirt. She is chasing a stray butterfly across the lawn. Her steps are deliberate and steady. She does not wear a back brace anymore. The titanium rods fused to her spine are invisible beneath her skin, holding her posture perfectly straight. She bends down to inspect a dandelion, giggles, and runs back toward the porch. There is no grimace of pain. There is no hesitation in her stride. I watch her move, and the memory of that sterile pediatric waiting room feels like a nightmare belonging to a different lifetime. My phone rests on the wooden table next to my coffee mug. It is quiet. For my entire adult life, that device was a tether to a machine that constantly extracted my energy, my money, and my peace of mind. I used to jump every time the screen illuminated, conditioned to expect a manufactured crisis, a demand for capital, or a passive-aggressive critique from my mother. Now, the screen only lights up with messages from my patients, appointment reminders, and texts from Sarah. The silence from my biological family is not an empty void. It is a protective shield. The legal and financial destruction of my parents was not a swift, cinematic explosion. In the real world, federal investigations operate like a slow, grinding glacier. They crush everything in their path with methodical, inescapable pressure. Following the tip I submitted to the Internal Revenue Service, the federal government conducted a comprehensive audit of my father's financial history. The findings were undeniable. He had systematically committed wire fraud by moving stolen funds across state lines to unregulated entities, executed a long-term embezzlement scheme, and deliberately concealed taxable assets to protect my brother's massive tax evasion. Because his primary portfolio was frozen by the Treasury Department, the bank holding the home equity line of credit executed their default clause. In late February, the 4,000-square-foot colonial house in Weston was put up for public auction. My parents were forced to pack 4 decades of accumulated status into cardboard boxes and vacate the premises. They relocated to a small 2-bedroom apartment in a town 30 miles away. They no longer attend gala dinners. They do not have a country club membership. The affluent social circle they spent their entire lives cultivating abandoned them the moment their federal indictments became public record. They are socially exiled and financially ruined, living off a heavily garnished pension. Julian's reality is far more severe. The federal authorities tracked the offshore betting accounts and charged him with massive tax evasion. Without my stolen retirement fund to float his lifestyle, his private bookies called in their debts. He fled the state. The last piece of information Sarah received through her legal network indicated he was living in a motel in Nevada, awaiting a federal court date, represented by a court-appointed public defender. The golden child, the supposed tech visionary, is now a ward of the state he tried to defraud. I did not orchestrate their downfall out of malice. I simply stopped being their human shield. I let the consequences of their own actions reach them. There is a final detail to this story, a piece of American legal infrastructure that provided the ultimate closure. When Sarah filed the whistleblower dossier, she used Internal Revenue Service Form 211. In the United States, if a citizen provides specific, actionable evidence that leads to the successful collection of unpaid taxes and penalties from a fraudulent party, the federal government issues a mandatory reward. The law dictates the whistleblower receives between 15% and 30% of the recovered funds. 2 weeks ago, I walked down my gravel driveway and opened my mailbox. Inside was a thick brown envelope featuring the official seal of the United States Treasury. It contained a federal check. The government had seized the offshore accounts, liquidated my father's remaining accessible assets, and collected their massive penalties. My percentage of that recovery was substantial. It was more than the original $100,000 they had stolen from me. I took that federal check, drove directly to the private medical lender, and walked up to the teller's window. I handed over the cashier check and paid off the predatory 25% interest loan in one single lump sum. I erased the debt I took on to save my daughter's life. I walked out of that bank building into the afternoon sun, carrying the zero balance receipt in my hand. And for the first time in 35 years, I was completely, undeniably free. Now the sun is setting over our rented farmhouse, casting long shadows across the wooden deck. Chloe is asleep upstairs, her breathing steady and unobstructed. The house is completely quiet. I sit at the kitchen table, looking at 2 pieces of paper resting on the wood. The framed whistleblower reward letter from the United States Treasury and the zero balance receipt from the medical lender. They are not trophies of vengeance. They are the receipts of my emancipation. Surviving a toxic family system and dismantling it from the inside is not just an act of self-preservation. It is a brutal, necessary education. If you are standing on the edge of your own familial breaking point, here are the 5 lessons I learned when the illusion of my family finally shattered. First, biology is a random assignment, not a binding contract. Sharing DNA does not entitle anyone to your peace, your labor, or your financial security. Love is a daily, active choice. If a relative's actions consistently communicate that you are merely a resource, you have no moral obligation to keep funding their comfort. Second, beware the sunk cost fallacy in human relationships. I endured their dismissal for 35 years because I kept waiting for the return on my emotional investment. I mistakenly believed my unwavering loyalty would eventually buy their respect. It never does. You cannot heal a sick dynamic by bleeding yourself dry. Walking away empty-handed is always better than staying and losing your future. Third, the silent enablers are just as guilty as the primary abusers. My mother never placed the sports bets, but she wore the designer handbags bought with the stolen money. She complained about my tears in the hospital corridor to protect her lunch reservation. The people who stand 3 feet away and watch you drown without throwing a rope have already chosen their side. Do not wait for them to save you. Fourth, the title of the independent child is often a calculated manipulation tactic. My parents constantly praised my resilience, so I would never ask for help. They called me their rock because rocks do not complain when you stand on them. True strength is not carrying their burdens in silence. True strength is dropping the weight and walking away. Fifth, a boundary is entirely meaningless without a consequence. I spent years asking them to treat me fairly. Pleading does not work on manipulators. A boundary is not a polite request, it is a locked door. When I finally stopped talking and handed the ledgers to the federal government, the dynamic shifted permanently. Action is the only language they understand. Society places an immense, unfair burden on children. We are told to keep the peace and accept toxic dynamics because family is supposed to be forever. But peace that requires you to surrender your dignity is not peace. It is just a payment plan for someone else's comfort. I am Elena. I am a mother, a physical therapist, and a woman who finally closed the ledger on a bad investment. If you are listening to this and recognizing the echoes of your own family, know that you are not trapped. You have the power to stop the transfers. You have the power to walk out. Scroll down into the comments and tell me the exact moment you realized you had to leave. Type the phrase, "My turn now," so I know you are ready to take your life back. If this story gave you a blueprint for your own freedom, please hit the like button and subscribe to Sweet Karma Life. We build our own families here based on truth, mutual respect, and holding the line. Thank you for listening. Protect your peace, build your boundaries, and I will see you in the next video.